Welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations, a series of short and shareable conversation starters for those of us who have or love and support people with a complicated and beautiful brain. Here's your host, Angela Geddes.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Kitchen Table Conversations. I'm your host, Angela, and so grateful that you have decided to spend some time with me again today. Today, I want to just kind of reflect on some of my experiences recently where I was at the Seattle, Washington FASD International Research Conference, and I just really appreciate attending these global, international conferences because I get to meet people from all over the world who have similar goals and aspirations and I would say similar frustrations as well. For those of you who know me, know that I'm very passionately involved in helping to raise awareness, trying to build capacity, and trying to make sure that there are fewer wrong doors for folks. And I'm here to say that this is something that, everyone at the conference could relate to. This is a global epidemic. Prenatal health is vitally important, and we're missing some pretty important elements of it when we consider preconception health, early conception or early pregnancy health, and the role of both parents in terms of the optimum development of our little people. So so I'm just going to kind of dive in and reflect and share what I learned and experienced while I was there. And I guess I have to be honest that traveling to the U.S. was a little different for me this time than it has been in other years. And I think that we all need to take a moment as Canadians and recognize that this has been a really odd time, and it was amazing because when I was over, when, we flew out of Detroit, we landed in Seattle without incident. The people were incredibly gracious and kind and nice and compassionate and helpful, just like they always are. So this is not a U.S. people problem, but this is certainly a different time for us traveling over. And I have to say, because I was going to a conference and I actually was presenting at the conference, I was worried about how that was going to be interpreted at the border. And then when I was over in the States, people asked me if I had any copies of my book for sale. And no, I didn't bring anything to make any money while I was across the border. And I guess it just added a layer. And if I were to be completely honest, I think many of us are experiencing a bit of grief and a bit of loss around all of this. And for me, I kind of feel like I lost a best friend and I have no idea what I did wrong. And so that was another element of this experience and added a layer of stress that I probably didn't need. But anyways, here we are. We made it back safe and sound. And I have to say that there were a few times where the American people actually apologized to me on behalf of their communities and really felt badly for what we are experiencing right now. So let's just be hopeful that maybe some things will turn around and I don't think things will ever be quite the same, but hopefully they'll be a little closer to where we were before. So the conference began with really powerful messaging and really amazing speaks about compassion and about the role of stigma and how we all have a role to play to help reduce it. And just hearing from people with living experience who understand how stigma impacts their day to day. And it was really fascinating because they were often saying, it's not the diagnosis itself that's the problem, it's the stigma that compounds the difficulties for sure and makes living with FASD so much harder. So they did say that stigma around FASD leads to silence, it leads to shame, and it leads to secrecy. It's not the name itself that harms us, said somebody with lived experience. It's the stigma surrounding it. So, and they also had a really beautiful conversation around the mothers that gave us life, So in many instances, people with FASD who have had diagnosis with FASD are not currently living with their biological parents. But there's also an effort made by people with living experience to stop demonizing the biological mothers and humanizing them, and stop treating them like they're the enemy, and start recognizing their struggles with compassion and with context. Nobody drinks with malicious intent. Nobody drinks or consumes a variety of different substances because they want to harm their growing baby. Right. So we need to really all work together to try to understand that. And then there was some other conversations around, unnaming FASD or changing the name around FASD. And the question would be, will that help fix the problem? Will that make it easier for some? Do some people look at the name FASD and experience more stigma attached to it? So there was some debate at the conference about whether changing the name would help to reduce that. But it seemed like the consensus was fairly, clear that language alone can't fix the problem, that still turns families away from services unless they already have a diagnosis. So I think many people feel like a diagnosis leads to a clear pathway of supports and services, and that is true. And there are many times where people do not have access to a formal diagnosis. So we are looking at function and continued difficulties that are not met with or without the diagnosis. So, but there are people who already have a diagnosis that are getting some of the supports and services they need, have developed a community of support, and really feel like for the first time that there's some clarity. They understand why some of these experiences they're having are a little bit more challenging for them than other people. They're understanding their symptoms in a better way, and now they kind of feel like they're sort of being dehumanized, and that might be taken away from them. And so they, really spoke very loudly and clearly that, don't take the name FASD away from us. We need to keep talking about it. And if we're going to work towards prevention, we need to keep talking about the role that alcohol plays in the development of our little people. So diagnosis is not a label. It's a key, they were saying, that, we need to be brave enough to ask the hard questions about prenatal alcohol and other substance exposures, because not asking about it doesn't make the challenges go away. In fact, avoiding diagnosis leads to lost investment opportunities, lost financial investment and emotional investment. And we're seeing many, many times where families break down, and situations where individuals are kind of detached from the people and the places that mean the most to them. And that could be different if there were meaningful support services that follow a diagnosis. So there was lots of really interesting conversations around that. And I, for one, kind of believe that we sort of have to do both. We have to continue to talk about prenatal alcohol exposure. We have to keep diagnosing FASD when we're able to. And we have to keep increasing our system's capacity to better screen and identify when individuals are presenting for mental health and parenting education and support services within our social welfare system all over, whether it be child welfare, whether it be justice, whether it be education or special education, whether it be in housing or our poverty programs, those kinds of things that address the social determinants of health. As I said, we need to be able to better identify so that people can get on a pathway of helpful and relevant supports, even without a formal diagnosis, because we know that we do not have the capacity. And we also know that despite the work that we're doing to reduce stigma around mental health and FASD in particular, even if we reduce stigma completely, which I'm not sure is possible, but even if we do, and we present families with the most compassionate, loving, caring, inclusive support services possible, the fact that alcohol and other substances have interfered with the development of their babies is going to inherently cause some barriers for some people. no matter how nicely we package that, right? So, and also biological families and biological mothers have to live with that understanding for the rest of their lives. And if, for example, they were struggling with serious addictions and mental health challenges at a particular time in their life, and then, 10 or 15 years later, their child is entering college programs or university programs and they need extra supports, talking about the diagnosis again is actually breaching some of their personal health history and the confidentiality that should be guaranteed to them, right? So it's not just a diagnosis that affects the individual. This is a diagnosis that affects the entire family and has special implications for biological parents without question. So I just don't think it's as simple, and I wonder if we could do a better job, making sure that we do both. So we do provide diagnosis for complex neurodevelopmental conditions related to potentially alcohol exposure, drug exposure, trauma, or other non-otherwise specified. Those are possibilities that would still enable an individual to get the kinds of supports they need to address their brain function and their body, their whole body experiences in a really good way. So FASD, the diagnosis, in my opinion, is an incredibly important one, and we certainly don't need to take it away. And we can offer other diagnoses that would assess function and enable really helpful supports as well as. So that's my kind of a strong opinion on that, because again, in Ontario, 99.5% of the people who should have an FASD diagnosis do not have access to an assessment. So as much as we want people to have an FASD assessment and get diagnostic clarity, it's not possible right now. Maybe someday it will be when we can continue to aim for that. But in the interim, we can't leave almost everybody who needs a diagnosis without one and without relevant services. So there, that's my thoughts on that whole thing. And then we also had conversations around systems that don't necessarily talk to each other. And there was a particularly heart-wrenching example of how systems kind of silo people and they don't talk and share information, and a very high-profile case that came up around Nick Cruz, and he was the Parkland shooter who later was identified to have been affected prenatally by alcohol and other exposures. But the way that we talked about Nick's mother in this situation, she was described as a prostitute, a drug addict, and an alcoholic, which to me are words that are so dehumanizing. And this was right after we spent the whole morning talking about stigma and how unfair it is. And then we talked about the adoptive parents as wanting the perfect family and not being forthcoming around prenatal alcohol exposure after the age of 3 because they didn't want him to have these areas of difficulty acknowledged, and they wanted to do whatever they could to just, kind of modify the behaviors and make sure that he could be somewhat more typical. But I have to wonder, they did disclose prenatal alcohol and other substance exposures when he went to a psychiatrist at age 3, and at that point it was sort of dismissed. So if a professional dismisses the role of alcohol and other substances, then you kind of move on. And just because that information wasn't shared, I know as a parent, I would assume that the medical records get shared with the experts, and this is common. One assessment builds on the other, but unfortunately that's not always the case. And in this case, it was it was absolutely catastrophic and probably one of the worst examples of where so many opportunities to intervene were missed. And this young person, has no idea why this all kind of transpired and why he is now going to have to spend the rest of his life in jail. So, I should say he knows why, but he didn't intend for any of this to happen, even though it did look like he was really being planful. So it's a bigger conversation, but it's the complexity around having a thought and connecting with the thought. And lots of us have inside voices, and we have thoughts that we would never ever act on, and we don't even really mean, and our thoughts are not actually facts. But for some people who have these thoughts and then ruminate about these thoughts, they start to really connect with these thoughts and believe that these voices that they're hearing or the thoughts that they're experiencing are an indication of their character, and in fact are giving them some sort of direction that they need to act on, whether or not it's right or wrong. So it's complicated. Again, it's way more than just this conversation. But again, if we can help people to disconnect from their thoughts and focus more on their values and their character and provide environments that support and nurture growth in those areas, and particularly in the areas of their strength, we can avoid, in many cases, some of these really awful circumstances from happening. So in this particular workshop, they were highlighting the Parkland shooter and all of the things that the system missed in that regard. They were also emphasizing the need for FASD to be treated as an equivalent to an intellectual disability, which would then, again, change the direction for people who are involved in the justice system. So these are not problems of character. These are symptoms of a brain injury. IQ isn't the full picture, and many individuals score average or above, but there's massive and complex internal discrepancies. So there is reduced capacity in many cases around risk awareness, abstract thinking, emotional regulation. But yet without the visible markers, they're often really misunderstood or blamed for bad behavior. So we need to continue to have those kinds of conversations. But regardless, the Parkland shooter, he did kill 17 people and he shot 34. So while we're fighting to make sure that he's not deemed as competent as somebody else, the bottom line is there are a lot of people who are no longer with us and who will be forever and ever and ever traumatized because of what he actually did. And he did it with the intent to die also. So as we're fighting to reduce the death sentences or the death penalty, or to make it so that he doesn't live in jail the rest of his life, but actually he didn't even want to continue living knowing what he did. So what we have to do is do what we can to avoid this, and beginning when he's 3 and not when he's 23. So yeah, lots of opportunities and heavy conversations, that's for sure. So we then went on to talk about midlife and FASD, dealing with parenthood and with family members who are aging and being in that sandwich generation with some extra complexities. So that was pretty powerful. And then we had a big keynote speak with Dr. Michael Golding, who presented on biology and how both parents really, really matter. And he presented some pretty cutting edge research around paternal alcohol use and how it also plays a role in FASD. Fathers who drank heavily around the time of conception had children with altered brain and liver development, reduced mitochondrial function, and placental deficiencies, even when the mother didn't consume any substances. So that's important information. And it just really, I think it really helps it does help to reduce the stigma and to reduce the pressure that we put solely on mothers. And I've had some mothers say to me, are you sure it was like, I didn't drink very much at all. My husband, on the other hand, really struggled with alcoholism at the time of conception. Is there any role for him to play? Right now, our guidelines for FASD indicate that mothers have to confirm, right? That there has to be confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure. But I'm here to say, and the research is now validating, that both parents have a role to play. So our messaging can be around prenatal health for both parents and preparing for pregnancies, which I think is really, really important. So, and then finally, a personal encounter. on the flight home. So, for both flights, actually, I spent most of my time reading a book called Nonviolent Resistance, second edition, A New Approach to Violent and Self-Destructive Children by Haim Omer. I am going to be working a little bit more closely with Dr. Maud Champagne to offer some more group opportunities for parents who are experiencing aggression within their home. And so I really wanted to take the quiet time to be able to read. So it wasn't very social, but I did get to meet finally at the end of the flight a woman beside me who was lovely. And she asked me what I did and what I was doing for a living, and I told her about the books that I have written and why I was in Seattle doing this presentation with Dr. Claire Mitchell around practical approaches to complex neurodevelopmental conditions and really trying to build a more inclusive service delivery system, focusing on awareness and prevention around prenatal health and prenatal alcohol exposure. And she said, "Oh, my mother had fetal alcohol." That's how she described it. That was the term that she used. She went on to describe her mother as being a really kind woman and a really lovely person. But when she was about 4, her and her siblings were placed in foster care because her biological mother just felt overwhelmed with the parenting demands, and she just wasn't able to handle it. And she recalls, as a young person, never seeing her mother not physically shaking with anxiety and probably some other physical symptoms that were neurodevelopmental in nature. So, but she spent her life in the foster care system. She reconnected with her mother when she was 18. And has a really pretty positive outlook a very positive outlook and a really positive relationship with her biological family as well. So it was just really neat. And that conversation kind of anchored everything that I'd heard at the conference. And but I just couldn't get over the irony to have somebody sitting right beside me who lived this experience firsthand. So again, behind every statistic, there's a story. Behind every diagnosis, there's a family. Behind every stigmatized label, there's a human being doing the best that they can, often with very little or no support and way too much judgment. So let's be brave enough to ask the hard questions. Let's bring these conversations back home to our kitchen tables. Let's work together and demand increased access to assessment and diagnosis. Not to shame, not to label, but to serve and to support. Let's center compassion within our messaging and let go of the fear that has kept some of us from having these kinds of conversations. It's dumbfounding to me that we've known about the risks associated with alcohol and other substances since the beginning, but yet we still don't really understand it on a broad-based level. The 2025 FASD International Research Conference reminded me that this work is as beautiful as it is complicated. It was really powerful. It was really emotional. It was really hard, but it was really loving and it was really compassionate. And I just am so grateful for the experience. So until next time, let's take good care of ourselves and each other. With many thanks, Angela.